Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sarah Mathew. She is Associate Professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. She studies the evolution of human ultra-sociality and the role of culture in enabling it. She is especially interested in how humans evolved the capacity to cooperate with millions of genetically unrelated individuals and how this links to the origins of moral sentiments, prosocial behavior, norms, and large-scale warfare. And those are the topics we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Mathew, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thanks, Ricardo.
So let's start perhaps. I think that I've already asked this question in one form or another to several different anthropologists, but in what aspects does human sociality differ from the sociality of other closely related species?
Yeah. To me, there are two main things that stand out about human sociality. One is that we are able to cooperate in these very large groups of genetically unrelated individuals, and also individuals who we don't really always know very well. Um, uh, that that is, a profoundly different form of cooperation than we see in pretty much any other species, because what I mean, in some ways, you can say that it's the first time in literally the history of life on Earth that we have a species that is cooperating in this way. Um, so cooperation itself is hard to achieve, but all of the previous instantiations of cooperation that we see has been with, genetic relatedness has been a very strong factor in facilitating that type of kind of transition in some ways. What's happened in humans is really I mean, I would say it's a singular event in the span of evolution to have something like this emerge. And I think different people have different ideas about what underlies this. I have my own particular biases and views, but I think everybody, would agree that this definitely is something that requires a lot of re-evaluation of what we think about what were the major evolutionary forces that were at play in shaping our species. The second part about human sociality that I think is very different is actually, I think, an area that has gotten much less attention, which is the intensive nature of small-scale cooperation in humans. So there's been a lot of emphasis on large-scale cooperation because of the understandable reason. It's completely unusual for a species to be doing this. But small-scale cooperation in humans, that's cooperation with one's close kin, cooperation with individuals that we have long histories with and we know them very well. Those have usually been relegated to stuff that we can easily explain because there's kin selection and reciprocity as mechanisms that we can use to account for that. But if we look more closely at the patterns of how humans cooperate in kin groups and how humans cooperate in what is called a more reciprocal fashion, that is with long-term social partners, we'll see that actually those two mechanisms on their own are not sufficient to explain what's going on. That is, you're getting a much, much more higher level operation than typically reciprocity, for instance, has supported in other organisms. And that is, I think, a bit of an understudied topic. And again, my views about what is driving that kind of cooperation has a lot to do with what is also actually driving large-scale cooperation in humans, which is the transition to becoming a hugely cultural, a species that relies heavily on culture and culturally transmitted norms and information. But I can get into that a little later. You probably have questions about that from down the road.
Yeah, sure. And is it that in your work, at least, you call it human sociality, ultra-sociality?
Yeah. Well, I mean, personally, I think that, when we see something that is so different from what we've gotten in any other species, it deserves it deserves its name. It's a kind of a label to recognize it for what it is. And the word eusociality has been used a lot to describe, systems like what we get in the insects, like ants and bees, etc., naked mole rats. But what's clear is that humans are not eusocial, which is, another indication of how the pathway that led to human sociality is so different from the pathways that led to hypersociality in these other systems. So humans are able to do hugely cooperative things, sometimes that mimic what happens in eusocial systems, like, going to warfare and having, um, individuals engage in self-sacrificial behavior for the sake of the group, building huge capital facilities and transfer of resources between different generations, etc. So in some ways, the outcome of human societies at different points in human history and across space and time can come close to what we would see in new social systems, but it's extremely clear that humans, each individual human, does not have such high levels of altruism that can explain, um, that can be, we're not ants. We're not individuals who, without a thought, would basically just suppress our own reproductive interests to benefit other individuals. We have a huge amounts of self-interest. We're, profoundly selfish in many ways, yet we're able to achieve these hugely cooperative outcomes. So I think the word ultra-sociality, I use it because hopefully it's an indication of this kind of more distinct form of sociality, which is not eusocial, in the sense of having genetically evolved mechanisms that make us just totally all the time consider what's best for the group, but we have the potential to achieve some of these outcomes through these kind of culturally transmitted norms and institutions that regulate our behavior. And I would argue processes like cultural group selection that, select for norms and institutions that confer, benefits to that make certain cultural groups and systems more successful than others.
And what is it that enables our human sociality as you described
Yes, so here is, so again, I'll go back to a statement I've said over and over again. We have a completely novel form of sociality that, we literally don't have an example of this in, the 2 billion years of evolution. And the the key that humans, the key factor that's driving this in humans is basically our strong reliance on culture. That is on the fact that humans kind of started for whatever reason. I think that, I don't personally think that cooperation was the reason humans became highly reliant on culture. Humans became highly reliant on culture probably for other reasons that had to do with, the value of technological, skills and know-how, and other kinds of ecological pressures that shaped humans, potentially bipedalism and having hands-free, etc. Like there are lots of things that may have gone on to help humans become a very cultural species. But one of the outcomes, one of the kind of almost, I would argue, like a byproduct of that, the emergence of this mode of transmission, is that you now have variation that can emerge between populations, and variation that can persist even when there is a lot of movement of individuals between groups, which is, usually a mental problem for why genetic evolution could not generate large-scale cooperation in a more consistent sort of way. So, so culture has this really phenomenal byproduct, which is that you can have variation between groups that can persist over time. And once you have variation between groups in their cultural, beliefs and cultural normative systems, there is potential for selection to act at that higher level, which is the level of cultural groups. And it is that aspect of culture that I think underpins how humans became cooperative in the manner that we did. Mm-hmm. And so, I guess some people might argue that just having culturally transmitted information could make us, smarter, could give us the know-how that we need to do a lot of things. And that also provides opportunities for us to develop social technologies. That, social technologies would be the norms and institutions that make humans able to solve collective action problems, etc. But I take a much stronger position on this, which is that I don't think that is sufficient to explain how culture shaped cooperation, because, individuals can get smart in many different ways by getting bigger brains, by developing cultural know-how, by acquiring technology, etc. But the selective forces, selection is not pushing towards cooperation in any of those mechanisms. So for selection to ever get to you cooperative outcomes, you kind of need selection at a higher level, at the group level. So I would argue that, it's not culture that drives human cooperation. It's the fact that culture creates the conditions for cultural group selection, which then can favor norms and institutions that provide group level benefits. And that is the key to how humans evolved our capacities for cooperation.
Right. And I think we will return to these later on in the interview, but I would like to ask you about cooperation and reciprocity specifically now. So about reciprocity, there are things that can impact it negatively or undermine it, and one of the things you explore in your work, for example, is perception errors. So what are these, and what strategies can people use to overcome their negative impact when it happens?
Yeah. So I'll just step back a little bit into basically maybe how I, got interested in the perception error problem, which is that the interesting thing about reciprocity is that it's such a beautiful theory for how you can get cooperation to evolve. And in some ways, people have found it very intuitive. It makes theoretical sense. It jives with our intuitions for how, we're going about in social repeated interactions. But the theory basically says that in some ways that you should find reciprocity evolving in a whole bunch of species that have, stable social systems and some kind of, cognitive mechanisms that can be used to keep track of individuals and what they've done in the past, which is true for many species. There are many species, social species, primates, social mammals, etc., who are living in these stable social groups in which they're repeatedly interacting with the same individuals, and they're keeping track of what individuals have done to them. Like they respond, for instance, in dominance interactions, etc., in ways that suggest that they are able to individuate and they are able to keep track. So a common assumption is that then in these species, we are not seeing reciprocity as much as the theory suggests, because the theory suggests there should be rampant reciprocity. Your condition for reciprocity is, almost you interact with somebody twice and on average, and you should be treating them like full siblings. And we know that that's just not what we see. Firstly, we see much fewer cases of reciprocity in other animals. And secondly, when we do see it, it occurs in much lower stakes types of interactions like grooming and things like that. Yet the theory suggests that, high stakes interactions, the ones that have high costs and high benefits, should be just as likely as low cost, low benefit interactions. So I think there's a huge mismatch between what the standard reciprocity theory suggests should be conditions that favor the evolution of reciprocity and what we're seeing in the animal kingdom. So then we kind of come to humans where we say, oh, and in humans it turns out that reciprocity does work. We're doing all these things with individuals that we know, and so the theory works, and possibly it's because humans have more to gain from these kinds of pairwise social interactions. There are more kind of ecological benefits, economic benefits. But what I've argued is that these ecological benefits to cooperation should actually be present in a whole different range of species. There's always benefits to doing things like turn taking, forming coalitions to defend particular resources. There's no real good reason to think that, in a whole bunch of other species, you don't have, these underlying economic gains that can be had from pairwise cooperation. So I think we have to look elsewhere for why there's such a profound discrepancy. If we look in my own experience, if we look more closely at human reciprocity, we find that human reciprocity is seldom a purely pairwise enterprise. It is reciprocity in the sense that we are updating how we want to treat another person based on how they've treated us in the past. But that relationship is usually embedded in this much more complex social world in which we are guided by normative expectations of how we need to treat this person. So if this person is a friend, in every culture, there are rules about, what you're obliged to give your friends, like where I work with the Turkana. If, man has a friend, he has certain obligations to go visit him, to, give an animal when his friend comes over to visit, etc. You can even think of pair bonds, marriage as, a pairwise repeated interaction in which players can update their decisions about whether they want to continue cooperating based on what they've seen in the past. But none of these social interactions are purely just based on these, what's happening between the pair of individuals. Instead, there are like lots of cultural norms that tell people what they should expect from their partner in this situation, and tell you what you need to deliver as a partner. And there is often third-party monitoring. People are paying attention to what's happening in people's pairwise social relationships, third parties. So there's both a huge role that norms play, cultural norms play in supporting human reciprocity. There's a huge role that third-party, interventions, monitoring, etc., play in human reciprocity. So that's kind of what led to thinking about what about reciprocity is missing from the standard model. So, that can help us explain this discrepancy between humans and other animals, and also the fact that, human reciprocity is not this pairwise enterprise. And that's kind of what led me to think a lot more about perception errors, because, and it's not to say that errors haven't been thought about. They've been thought about a lot in game theory and even in the evolution of reciprocity. But a lot of the errors, successful renditions of strategies that can deal with errors have had to do with implementation errors. That is, errors in which, the player who commits the mistake, as well as the partner, basically can recognize that, an error has happened. But in perception errors, basically, two parties can have different perceptions about what transpired. Like, for example, if you sent me an email asking me, whether I'd like to be interviewed by you, and that email went into the spam folder and I never ever saw it, your belief is that I kind of defected on this interaction. And my belief is I never ever heard from Ricardo, right? So there are many, many situations in which you can have individuals have different perceptions about what happened, because in the real world, in models, what we do is we specify that there's a B and a C, a benefit and a cost, and we can assign different values to that parameter and see what happens. But in the real world, first of all, there is no like labeled B and C. Instead, individuals have to infer, how much it cost your partner to do what they were doing. How much did your, partner, what kind of benefits did that partner receive? What was the state of need of the partner when the partner asked for help? What was your state? Were you in a position to help, etc.? And so there can be plenty of opportunities for divergences between the states, information states of these two parties. And my view is that these perception errors, so previously perception errors have been modeled, but at like low rates, in which, it's under 5% error rates. And, but my view is that perception errors are basically omnipresent. That is, literally in every interaction, there's the possibility for, there's a decent chance that, when something transpires, people can end up, the two parties can have different opinions about what happened. And one party might perceive a defection and the other party perceives that they had cooperated. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of, if we think about it, that's the story of interpersonal relationships in general, is the story of differences in perceptions about what happened. Right? And we have our ways to solve it, but that is something that seems to be possible for humans using some of these other mechanisms, like cultural norms that dictate more specifically what are the conditions under which you're supposed to do X for this individual. What are the conditions under which this individual needs to do something for you, and other people kind of watching and chipping in to comment on what is going on, so that both parties can kind of align their expectations and align their beliefs about what happened. So that's kind of what led to formalizing this intuition in a paper that I worked on with Rob Boyd, in which we introduced a strategy called arbitration tit for tat, in which when two players basically, when one player perceives a defection, they can basically invoke a third party to adjudicate, to say what happened. And that, for instance, we have that formalized in court systems, for instance. That's exactly what happens a lot. Most of the conflict that courts are dealing with is not supporting large-scale cooperation. It's basically managing disputes and disagreements between parties, often who know each other really well. But even before we have formal courts, it turns out that people have all these systems, informal systems of kind of stepping in to adjudicate disputes. And when we formalized that into the arbitration tit for tat strategy, we found that even with very high rates of error, you can get reciprocity, high rates of perception error, you can get reciprocity to evolve, and the adjudication process cannot be random. And that's part of the reason why it might not be possible in species in which other individuals, third parties, are not participating by monitoring what's going on so that they can provide an opinion that's better than chance about who made the mistake. So it's not that you can just toss a coin and say, okay, let's just start afresh tossing a coin and go from here, because that's going to, if arbitration is random like that, you're going to end up, ATFT is not going to be a stable strategy. But if arbitration is more accurate than chance, that is, in some ways third parties are genuinely tracking what is happening with others, then even if it's not perfectly accurate, it does a huge amount to essentially facilitate reciprocity-based cooperation, even when perception error rates are really, really high, like 40%, for instance, of interactions have perception errors. So that is kind of part of the explanation, I think, for, it's not the sole explanation, but I think part of the explanation for why you have humans relying on reciprocity to a much greater extent than other animals, not because humans have more economic gains to be had from pairwise interactions. I think a lot of species do, but because other species kind of haven't solved this omnipresent perception error problem, because they don't have third-party monitoring that can help with it.
With that in mind, how is it that humans can cooperate with such an immense number of genetically unrelated individuals? What gives a basis to that?
Yeah. So I think that cooperation in these transient interactions with people who we don't know very well is the key to how we can scale up cooperation, because there are limits to how many people we can know well. There's fundamental informational restrictions prevent the scaling up of cooperation beyond a few hundred or thousands of individuals with just systems like reputation-based cooperation alone. So when we get this super big scaling up, which we have seen over the course of human history, I think that the best explanation for that is the emergence of cultural norms and institutions that tell us that we need to cooperate with people who are part of this social group. So for instance, the Turkana, the folks that I study up in northern Kenya, they are a population of about 1 million people. That's definitely a number that's far beyond what you can sustain cooperation with just through reputation and social networks alone. What they have, though, is rules that specify that if somebody identifies as a Turkana, you're not supposed to harm them in many ways, and you're supposed to help them, even if you don't know them. But if somebody is not a Turkana, there's a lot of things you are allowed to do in terms of taking stuff from them, harming them for your own benefit, and you're not obliged to help them in the same way. So what I would say helps us explain why the Turkana are able to cooperate in large groups. And by cooperation here, I mean, for instance, one of the biggest forms of cooperation is not harming, is, social order, in which you have reduction of rates of interpersonal violence between individual Turkana. You have regulation of stealing. You have property rights and things like that. That's one of the. It's sometimes we think of things like warfare as the only examples of, or building large capital facilities as the main examples of large-scale cooperation, but the lack of crime, imposing, social order on these huge scales is also a form of large-scale cooperation. And the reason they have that is because they have these rules, and the content of the rules is that if you're a Turkana, these rules apply. If you're not a Turkana, these rules don't apply. And so once you have a norm like that, you can get cooperation at these large scales. The question is what selects for norms like this? Why is it that, over the course of cultural evolutionary history, we've ended up with norms that support particular kinds of large-scale cooperation, but not others? And here, my work has implicated cultural group selection as one of the main engines for what is driving the evolution of social norms and institutions that regulate cooperation. And the reason I would argue that it's not just norms that help you get cooperation, because norms can help you get anything, can help you get pretty bad outcomes that don't provide benefits. It can also help you get cooperation at much smaller scales, like the Turkana could easily have had a norm that said just cooperate with people who are part of your settlement or part of your clan, and it's okay to then steal animals from people from another clan or another settlement. But that's not the norm they have. They have a particular norm that has a particular scale at which it's conferring benefits, and for them it's the scale of the ethno-linguistic group. So then a really big question is, why do you see it at that particular scale? Because firstly, it could be at a smaller scale. Secondly, it could also be at a larger scale. Why don't the Turkana care about other pastoralists that share their way of living in many ways? So there are other semi-arid, mobile pastoralists all living in northern Kenya that they are, at in certain ways, there's a lot of things that they share in terms of how they're making a living, in terms of their relative places in the nation state system, etc. But you're not getting Turkana norms to, be inclusive, to include people like the Samburu and the Borana and the Rendile, or the Toposa, the Nyangatom, the Dodos, the Karamajong, the Ga, all these groups that surround them. You somehow are not getting norms that help the Turkana cooperate beyond the scale of the Turkana. So, and there are huge costs to not cooperating at these larger scales too, because what you see in this particular system is that there's huge, limitation of resources like grazing areas and dry season water wells. But because of the lack of cooperation, there are, these really big no man's lands between these groups that are being, underutilized because, people don't want to get too close to the opponent's side. And so, sometimes some of the richest pasture areas are not being used until it becomes late in the dry season and people have no other way. So then they start moving closer to each other and utilizing them. And there's huge amounts of mortality due to the intergroup conflicts that arise due to the lack of cooperation. So it's extremely costly that they're not cooperating at this bigger scale. So why are they not able to achieve this kind of larger scale cooperation? If it's all about, thinking with our brains, oh, wouldn't it be really useful for us to like sit down with the other group, talk about it, and, invent institutions that can solve this problem? Why is that not happening? It's not happening because people don't know that, people know that, yes, they could potentially, cooperate with these other folks. If they sit down, create, say that they're going to, have a peace agreement, etc. But selection is not creating norms that are persisting at that scale. And I think the reason for that is because the main engine that's driving norm evolution is cultural group selection. And so cultural group selection is going to operate to create competition between culturally variable groups. And that means that unless the cultural complex becomes much larger, so, the cultures of these different groups, the norms, the values, the beliefs, etc., become much more similar, they're not going to be able, you're not going to get selection favoring norms that increase the scale of cooperation. But in, over history, we do see that that does happen. There is, you have lots of instances in which cooperation has scaled up in human societies, and that happens exactly because you're getting cultural homogenization of people who, were previously had different cultural values, beliefs, etc. And it doesn't have to happen in all aspects of culture, the cultural homogenization, but it has to happen on certain key dimensions that regulate cooperation. And successful nation states, for instance, are examples of when that happens well, or even state societies in the past. One of the big things that state societies have done was, to integrate previously more ethno-linguistically diverse groups of people and give them kind of like a common law, some kind of common cultural system in which they could operate. But you also see that there's constant struggles against that, ethno-linguistic factions are often the weaknesses of nation states, and it's a constant struggle because there are forces that are kind of pulling norms and institutions to support cooperation at scales at which there's cultural variability. And if there's deep cultural variability within nation states among the different ethno-linguistic groups that's just not kind of going away, then this selection is going to pull towards that disintegration. So that was a long answer to a short question, so I'll stop now.
Another question then. What leads to warfare? What are the conditions where people resort to that?
Yeah, so I guess I might say that I have maybe a bit of an unusual answer to this. I think that cooperation, large-scale cooperation, leads to warfare. So much so that I would even say that large-scale cooperation makes warfare inevitable. And you do see that in all these systems in which you get, high levels of cooperation among large numbers of entities, you also get warfare, because warfare requires cooperation among the individual units, but warfare also allows for these collective benefits in terms of acquisition of resources from neighboring groups, and self-defense against outsiders, etc. The huge benefits that, in an evolutionary sense, that warfare provides can be reaped by social organisms that have solved the problem of cooperation. The only thing that is standing between lots of different species on Earth and warfare is the fact that they can't solve the problem of cooperation. If they do solve the problem of cooperation, I think warfare is inevitable. And your ants, for instance, are a great example. They solve the problem of cooperation, and you get warfare as one of the outcomes of it. Multicellular organisms, I mean, we have immune systems that are basically, like genocidal machines that, are just orchestrated and organized in this really, really functional way to, to protect this cooperative society. That's the multicellular organism. Naked mole rats, another species in which you get intergroup conflict, lethal intergroup conflict, and we have humans who've solved the problem of cooperation, and warfare is one instantiation of that kind of cooperation. So what I think is that when it comes to warfare, it's not difficult to explain why, selection would favor the use of violence to get more resources. That's, we know what is the underlying, selective forces that drive violence. We see lots of violence in the animal kingdom when the costs outweigh the benefits, and there are a lot of times in which the benefits outweigh the costs. But warfare is, we are not seeing warfare in these systems because of the lack of cooperation. And once we do get cooperation, all of those same conditions that have favored violence in interpersonal interactions become accessible in the context of intergroup conflict. And that's part of the reason why I've studied warfare, because I think I was really driven to the question of warfare because it was one of the starkest renditions of human cooperation, in which, you're able to get norms and institutions evolved that make people who are fundamentally kind of selfish, who have some pro-social preferences, but I would say mostly norm-compliant preferences, to undertake these acts in battle that are, that's very, very hard to explain from an evolutionary perspective, unless we can explain how we get cooperation within groups that then facilitates this type of behaviors.
So changing topics, getting into another topic that I've read about in your work, I would like to ask you, what is moral injury and how does it relate to something like PTSD?
Yeah. So I was led into that line of work through my research on warfare because, I'd started off by trying to study warfare as this cooperative, as this implementation of a high stakes form of cooperation, which kind of
Mm-hmm.
was the reason why I ended up working with the Turkana pastoralists up in northern Kenya. And when I set out to, study them, my mind was, not anywhere close to the questions surrounding PTSD and combat stress, etc. But as I, kind of did all the interviews that I had done to get at some of my initial questions about cooperation, I mean, one of the things that really stands out is the very risky nature of everyday life there, because close to the border with that of the Turkana and the Toposa, for instance, the Turkana can be attacked at any time. When they're asleep at night, their settlements can be surrounded, and they just then have gunfire into their homes. The women, children, men, anyone can be hurt. When men are going out herding to take their animals, on the daily routes, they can be attacked, and so they often have to go ahead and patrol the area to see if there's any, enemy footsteps, etc., and kind of basically be so hyper vigilant, not just in the context of going on raids, which is a much more kind of defined activity, but also in just how they live their everyday life. And there are huge, very high rates of mortality from warfare in the population that I worked with basically about 50% of adult male mortality in the border area is from warfare, and about 25 to 40% of men have suffered multiple bullet wounds. So as I started reading more about the importance of combat stress and PTSD in the American context, which is kind of in some ways a very important and puzzling question, is what is leading to the high rates of PTSD and also suicide rates among U.S. Military service members. At some point, there were more veterans that were dying of suicide than people were dying serving in the military. So the kind of highest risk of joining the military became the fact that that it was creating the conditions for suicide among people who joined and then retired. So that is in some ways firstly a puzzle, right? Is, you would think that the hardest part about getting people to do war is the part about getting them to take the physical risks for the sake of the group, and like making these kind of life and death decisions in which they have to think about the goals of the larger mission and their team members and not about themselves. You'd think that that's maybe the hardest part about warfare based on everything that I've said so far. But it's oddly enough, in contemporary America, the hardest part about being in the military is, these mental health symptoms that people are experiencing, sometimes while they're serving the military, but oftentimes after they leave the military and reintegrate back into civilian life. So that kind of gives you, prompted me to think a little bit more about this question, because on the face of it, it seemed a little bit like, it doesn't fit in with what the ideas about warfare that I was, I was reiterating and reinforcing in my own work. I, in some ways, thought, okay, well, the Turkana are a really great system to see whether something like PTSD is an evolved response, protective response that can, allow people to safeguard against these, really big dangers, life and death situations that they're encountering on a daily basis. And that is part of the explanation, part of some of the evolutionary explanations for PTSD that have been proposed in the past. And this would have been one way to test whether that's, part of what's going on, because if that is, then Turkana warriors should have high rates of these types of protective PTSD symptoms. Right. But when you look at the PTSD symptoms, you'll see that, only some of them have to do with, responses that you would have if you were to want to protect yourself from physical danger. So, being hypervigilant, easily startled, remembering the events, these kind of intense life and death events, having nightmares about it, etc. Those are kind of symptoms that in a functional sense, you would think this is what an organism would need to have if they were to, need to be learning from this experience and being prepared to quickly react to this experience. But there's a whole host of PTSD symptoms that don't fit that criteria. That basically are the depressive symptoms that correspond more to depression. And those don't make as much, sense from this type of evolutionary functional perspective that have been proposed by people before. So what I did with Matt Zefferman, my collaborator on this project, was that we kind of developed a gene culture coevolutionary explanation for the larger portfolio of PTSD symptoms, in which we argued that, just like other people have said before, some set of symptoms have to do with learning and reacting to the physical dangers of warfare. But another set of symptoms, the depressive symptoms, we hypothesized had more to do with responding to the social dangers of participating in warfare. So what would be the social dangers of participating in warfare? We argued that the social dangers basically are coming from the kind of complicated normative landscape that people have to tread when they participate in something like warfare, in which there's a lot of harm being caused on some individuals who don't, who fall outside of some arbitrary in-group, right? So one can easily, if one doesn't get the norms, the normative landscape right, one can easily kind of make a mistake there and, for instance, cause harm on individuals who were meant to, be left alone, or who were meant to be protected. And there are a lot of trade-offs in the decision making. People have to, weigh the cost of, the success of the mission versus civilian casualties. And there are norms and rules that regulate all of human warfare, which is another argument that Matt Zefferman and I have made about what is the engine of human warfare, that, human warfare is a cultural technology. It's cooperation, and that cooperation is facilitated in humans through, these cultural institutions. So warfare doesn't ever happen outside of a very rich landscape of rules that tell us who are the people that is okay to kill. How are we supposed to do it? What are some of the decision-making trade-offs that need to be made in terms of valuing some set of people's lives over other set of people's lives? So the way that humans engage in warfare is embedded in this kind of normative landscape. And if that is the case, then, and that is, the reason why people go on wars, is because there are norms that tell them they should do this, but they shouldn't do that, etc. Then people, while they're participating in warfare as combatants, they should also be highly vigilant to the social risks, which is of accidentally, inadvertently doing the wrong thing or doing what they think was right, but that other people in their community perceive as wrong. And so they could potentially face social sanctions for that. And we argued that that's probably what might be leading to the depressive symptoms, because there have been other people who argued that depressive symptoms are kind of a way of ameliorating the social consequences of norm violations, etc. And so then we expected that in a system like the Turkana, where warriors are so deeply integrated into the community and the community members experience the same kind of risks that warriors are experiencing in the context of defensive warfare, everybody's norms are pretty much, much more aligned. There isn't this kind of warrior subculture and the larger community culture. So there's much lower levels of social risks that Turkana warriors are taking. They experience the physical risks, but not so much the moral risks in some ways. Whereas in the US, the warriors, soldiers are basically, in some ways being enculturated in a way that civilians are not. There are a lot of changes that happen over the course of, military training. And then for a period of time, they're embedded in this community in which people share their norms. But then once they retire and step back into civilian life, they, potentially are going to find that there's big divergence between their kind of normative system and the normative system of civilians, especially in attitudes related to warfare and combat, etc. So we call that, and that has been called moral injury by other researchers. So basically what we argued was that moral injury is going to instantiate itself in the form of depressive symptoms of PTSD, and the kind of combat stress in terms of the physical danger is going to instantiate in terms of these other symptoms, these learning and reacting symptoms. And that is, we find some support for this hypothesis in two ways. One is that we found that the Turkana did have high rates of high PTSD severity scores, but the relative rates of these learning and reacting symptoms were higher or similar to that of American soldiers. But for the same symptom severity as American soldiers, they had lower relative rates of the depressive symptoms. The second thing that we found that supported this hypothesis is that now within the Turkana, people who had warriors who had been more exposed to moral violations, either as perpetrators or victims, who had been more exposed to social sanctions for their actions in combat, and warriors who had a larger moral sphere, that is, who had more concerns about the welfare of the opponent. Those warriors had relatively higher rates of depressive symptoms than Turkana warriors who had lower scores on these. So basically, within the Turkana, we're finding that exposure to moral violations and, having this kind of more encompassing moral system in which people who are not Turkana also have some, you need to be concerned about their welfare to some extent. Those people are more likely to experience the moral injury, meaning the depressive symptoms of PTSD. So that is what we argued is the connection between PTSD and moral injury. In some ways, we're arguing that those have different evolutionary roots, and the evolutionary roots of moral injury-based symptoms can really be understood only if we think about gene-culture coevolution, because you would get a physiological response system like that only if warfare was being fought in a very culturally specified, way, and not, if we just had some genetically evolved predispositions to form coalitions of people and just go and fight other people.
Right. So, in the interest of time, I would like to ask you about one last topic. Perhaps this is something we've already alluded to earlier in our conversation, but in what ways does culture facilitate small-scale cooperation? I know that you have a paper on how third-party monitoring supports dyadic reciprocity, for example. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I, as I'd kind of argued earlier, I think that the small-scale cooperation aspect of humans is often just kind of put aside because it looks like there's a lot of parallels between small-scale cooperation in humans and what we see in other organisms, and some of the mechanisms of small-scale cooperation, like kin selection and reciprocity, seem to, on the face of it, do a lot of the heavy lifting for explaining why humans, are cooperating in small groups. But I've argued that a closer look at small-scale cooperation in humans would suggest that that culture and cultural norms and third-party norm enforcement, third-party monitoring, third-party adjudication, all these things are playing a much bigger role in regulating small-scale cooperation in humans than people are giving credit for. So on the one hand, anthropologists have for long documented a lot of the norms of different societies. If you look at these norms, a lot of these norms actually are regulating things that are happening within families and among people who know each other really well and who are doing repeated interactions. So there are cultural norms. If you think about classical ethnographies of societies, they would talk about, what is their system of inheritance? Who should you pass on your wealth to? Who you should pass on your wealth to is, something that is completely determined by kin selection. That is the main mode by which an organism is transmitting resources to the offspring, right? Mm-hmm. So you would think that why in the world do you need norms? Why in the world do people need instructions for who they should give their wealth to? Why can't it just be something that we are optimizing? Why don't you get genetic evolution to optimize how people make decisions about who to pass on, which spring to pass on their wealth to, how to divide it, etc. Because in every other species, that's exactly, how parental investment works. Genetic evolution is getting us to the equilibria that we see based on, the costs and the benefits for the parents and, Hamilton's rule, etc. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, if we just think of that example, there's really a profound disconnect between what we think is, we say that parental care, parental investment, that's stuff we can explain with kin selection. Yet, on the other hand, cultural anthropologists and even some evolutionary anthropologists have, for long been talking about how these systems are highly regulated by culture.
Right.
And it's people don't have full choice. I mean, they might kind of do things that are more in their interest and try to manipulate the space within which they have options. But by and large, when people in a system in which you need to divide your wealth equally among all your children, if you just decide I'm going to give it to my son, because my eldest son, because I think my eldest son has the best prospects, people will you will experience social sanctions in either some kind of if not necessarily explicit punishment, but people will there will be some kind of social consequences for that, and as a result, people are not optimally using the strategies that kin selection should tell them that they should use. So I think that I've just given you one example of this, but there are many other examples of how much cultural norms dictate what goes on within families, how to run a household, who should be the one doing the different kinds of labor. Should the men be the sons be herding, the women be helping with household chores, etc. Individuals are not making decisions that are finding the optimum like they are in other species. Instead, they're following cultural rules, and if they deviate from those cultural rules, there is some kind of there is social pressure to conform to those rules. Where you stay after marriage, right? How many wives you can have. I mean, why is that culturally regulated? That's, in some ways, you would think that that's another context in which individuals should be able to use the full space to determine what is the strategy that's optimal for them. Yet there's huge constraints on that. And that is, I think, a really appreciated aspect of what is setting human cooperation apart from the cooperation in other species. And I've argued that essentially it's culture and cultural norms that then have solved a lot of the constraints on cooperation that mechanisms like reciprocity have, because of things like perception errors, etc., and have ended up allowing humans to sustain much, much, much higher levels of cooperation among close kin and well-known individuals than you would expect from the standard mechanisms. So that's, I guess, a short spiel. And to be fair, I have a much more well-developed explanation for what is different between human reciprocity and reciprocity in other animals. Why you might get that discrepancy because of the third-party monitoring. Whereas for kin selection, I think it is actually still a puzzle. Why? Because that is a mechanism that we know works really well, and it's not just that mechanism has gotten validation in the context of cooperation. It's gotten validation from a whole bunch of different aspects of animal behavior. So it's harder to explain kind of what else humans have that's basically accelerating kin selection so much, or basically what we have is kin-based cooperation on steroids, because or you can argue maybe, kin-based cooperation that is that's influenced heavily by cultural norms and institutions. The reason why we do that, why it provides an improvement over standard kin selection, why it's adding more, I think is a little bit more of a puzzle on the kin selection side than the reciprocity side. But it's something that I'm, interested in exploring down the line.
Great. So, Dr. Mathew, before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Okay, yeah. The best way is probably to Google my name and find me on Google Scholar. The only thing is that you must make sure you spell my name correctly because it has a strange spelling that is not the common spellings that people assume. And also my website, which is sarahmathew.net, is probably the place where one can most easily find not just my publications, but a lot of other resources that are related to my field work and my lab here at ASU, etc.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Mathew, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Ricardo, for the opportunity to share all this stuff.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deja Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.